CU Law Associate Professor and the Director of the Silicon Flatiron's AI Initiative, Harry Surdin. Welcome, Harry, and he'll introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Amy, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel of day 2 of the Silicon Flatiron's TILT conference. Today, we'll be talking about building trustworthy hardware. So as Amy said, I'm Harry Surdin. I'm a professor of law at the University of Colorado Law School. I teach about technology and law, and I'm also faculty director at the Silicon Flatiron's Center and head of the Artificial Intelligence Initiative. And I want to thank Amy and Vanessa and the rest of the Silicon Flatiron's crew who have done an amazing job and worked so hard in putting this conference together. Really grateful for that. So joining me today for this panel is a really accomplished and terrific group of panelists. I'm so honored that they've joined us today. In the interest of time, I will just briefly state their name and affiliation, but we have much more detailed biographies on our terrific panelists on the website. So I refer you to the conference website if you have more, if you want to find out more about our distinguished guests. But let me just start in alphabetical order here. Joining me are Jennifer Roberts, who's the Deputy Director and at the DARPA Information Innovation Office. Next, we have Brian Scriber, who is a distinguished technologist and Vice President of Security Technologies at Cable Labs. Next, Kim Wachtel, Vice President of Growth Engineering and User Experience at JumpCloud. And last but not least, Jessica Wilkerson, who is Cyber Policy Advisor at the FDA Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful that you're here. So far in this conference, we've heard a great deal about trustworthiness in technology. And in this panel, we'll be focused on trustworthiness in hardware and systems. We will be addressing topics such as what kind of systems and hardware need to be trustworthy? Are we talking about wearables? Are we talking about medical devices? Are we talking about defense infrastructure, cell phones, all of the above? What does it mean for a hardware system to be trustworthy? Are we talking about authentication? Are we talking about accuracy, privacy, or other principles? We'll try and tease those out. When we say that a system is trustworthy, we mean trustworthy to who? The end users, the creators, the public, somebody else. So without further delay, let's dive right in and start talking about these topics. So I'm going to address the first question to Jennifer, and then open it up to the rest of the panel afterwards. Jennifer, what in your opinion does it mean for a hardware system to be trustworthy? And what are some examples of the kinds of systems in society that we might want to be trustworthy?
Jennifer, we can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Okay, great. So glad that's working. So I would agree with everything that you just pointed out as being key aspects of trustworthiness. So to kind of expand on that, I'm going to be coming from a computer science perspective, a software perspective. And I think really what makes trustworthiness complicated these days is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to separate the hardware trustworthiness from, say, the cyber trustworthiness, right? Because all of our hardware systems, many more, growing number of hardware systems have some type of embedded compute. There's a growing number of hardware devices that have some type of AI embedded in them. And because of that, our sense of trustworthiness really needs to expand. And our technology for making sure that systems perform in the way that we expect needs to expand as well. So when we're talking about trustworthiness, I would say, that includes also things like resilience against cyber attack, resilience to different component failures, and really the ability for that hardware to act in the way that we expect even if there are unexpected changes, either changes that the person who designed it didn't anticipate it because the user's using it in a different way than what they thought, or some type of system failure or accident, right? We still want there to be some type of graceful failure in these edge cases. And doing that is really a very difficult design challenge. Um, Other things to be thinking about from a trustworthiness perspective, we want to make sure that we have trust in our supply chains, right? So as we are delivering components, et cetera, that they're not having some type of either cyber attack or other type of back end vulnerability being introduced that we're not even aware of. We want to also, whenever possible, incorporate formally verified components on the software side so that it is not possible, even if somebody were to cyber attack. So think on your car, somebody attacked the entertainment system, was able to get in. We don't want them to be able to take over the steering, right? We want to be able to have these guards and if possible, do that in a way that's mathematically verified, provably correct. And at the end of the day, we want to make sure that things are safe. Now, in terms of the types of systems that we care about, as you've mentioned, they go across the board, right? We are all dealing with hardware devices at home, right? Our entertainment systems, our phones, our communication networks, they're very embedded in the way that we live. They're also key in our businesses, our governments, and they span across, many different parts of the economy, the government, medical systems, the power grid, financial systems, all of these things that we implicitly rely on. So the hardware systems and that trustworthiness is important and cross-cutting. Also expanding into, computer networks, communication networks, and vehicles, right? So the vehicles are a whole nother area that's very important because, when things go wrong in that sector, it really can have some very dire consequences. So I think, the really interesting aspect to this trustworthiness, again, is this interplay between the hardware and software, right? Because it's changing the way that we are thinking about securing hardware systems because the types of approaches that you take to deal with, say, a physical component failure is very different than the type of approach that you take for cyber resilience, and we need to start building systems that marry those two.
Great. So let me just summarize a little bit of what you just said, and there was a really terrific answer, and then throw it out to that same question to the rest of the audience. So what I heard you saying is that we need to think about hardware, not just in terms of the physical hardware, but also the integration of hardware and software and how those interact. And then some of the principles you highlighted there were resilience and graceful failure in the event of unexpected activities such as hacking or other failures. One thing I really liked is you highlighted trust in the supply chain. It's all well and good to have your component be great, but if one of the pieces along the way is infiltrated or hacked, that might undo all your work. You talked about formally verifying systems, so to make them ensuring that they're not able to be accessed from another system mathematically. Thank you. So let me throw those same two questions out to the rest of the panel. What does it mean in your opinion, for a hardware system to be trustworthy? And what are some examples in society of systems that we would like to be trustworthy? And you can just raise your hand. I saw Jessica.
Yeah, so I was also unmuting myself, so I'm hoping I'm not doubling more and more lately. But yeah, I think I can definitely piggyback on all of this because coming from the Food and Drug Administration, a great deal of what Jennifer just said is entirely relevant to medical devices keeping people alive. If you have a medical device that fails not gracefully, there's a very significant chance you're going to have patient harm, you're going to have patient impact. And so it's very critical to FDA, and this is the way that we have been approaching these issues for several years now, is that the system design, whether it's a cybersecurity component, it's a hardware component, whatever it is, it has to take into account the cybersecurity risks that could be faced and potentially mitigate for them. And FDA is certainly getting stricter and stricter about what we expect. One thing that I would say, and I'd be interested to hear what the rest of the panel thinks, I think, Jennifer had pointed out we need to start differentiating a little bit, not differentiating, but we need to be, paying attention to the interplay between hardware and some of the other components. I think for, at least for medical devices, we don't differentiate that much. It's the device is the device. And even for us, speaking of supply chain and related issues, the device is the device. The data coming into the device is also relevant. You can't just sort of say, this is the device, that's the data. These are two separate things. But we don't necessarily draw those hard and fast lines between this is a hardware concern, this is a software concern, and here's what you're expected to do for each. We take it as a system approach. The system itself has to be securable, has to be demonstrably safe, has to be effective, and all of that.
Great. That's a really great point, Jessica. And one thing I like that you highlighted there is the data. So these days, more and more, the software is the data because it takes its functionality from whatever data is fed into it. So that has to be part of any trustworthy solution. Brian, I saw that you have a comment.
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me to join the panel. I love what Jennifer was saying and what Jessica was saying as well. I think we're on the right track here. The idea of, yes, the data comes in, the software's here, the hardware's here. We can look at it as a whole system. One of the things that we have to be aware of, though, is that these systems can be changed, right? So firmware gets updated on a device. That's not the same device it was 5 minutes ago. And it can now use the credentials that you gave it to do some tremendously dangerous things to the network, to other devices, to people whose lives depend on it. When we talk about trust in a human engagement, we build trust based on previous experiences, and that relationship comes from repeated delivery on expectations. So, Harry, if you and I were having a conversation, you promised to do something and you delivered, my trust in you is going to go up, right? That continues to go up. When you don't deliver, it diminishes a bit. Not that you ever wouldn't, but with devices, that device may have delivered on all of its expectations for the last 3.5 years, and it may be perfect. That doesn't mean that you can trust it in the next minute, right? It's kind of the gambler's fallacy with security. There is always an opportunity for that device to do something wrong. And that's where I think we're going to get into some of this later in the panel. So I won't dive into how we need to put those guardrails up. But I want to point out trust in our technical environment is by nature different than trust in the human environment, and we can't use the same tools in both.
I love that comment, Brian, and it really ties into Jennifer's comment that the hardware and the software are interrelated. So if the software is changing over time, then in effect the system is changing over the time, and the system that you used yesterday might appear to be the same to the end user, but might in fact under the hood be a totally different system due to firmware updates. And we're seeing good examples of that. Jennifer mentioned vehicles, and Tesla does weekly updates to the firmware of their cars. So the car you drive yesterday is effectively a different car. And then to Jessica's point, the data, machine learning systems are learning sometimes based upon new data. Kim, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on what Brian said and something Jennifer mentioned at the beginning as well. I mean, I think from my perspective, a huge part of sort of setting ourselves up to be trustworthy with devices is really understanding that expectation that the humans who are interacting with the device have. And I think, we can get it wrong if it starts behaving in a way that they just wouldn't expect, whether that's based on past behavior, like Brian was pointing out, or maybe it's a device that the public is interacting with and they just sort of make an assumption that it would be secure, but there's some sort of privacy data leak or that sort of thing. So I feel like it really is critical to zoom out when we're talking about this and think about who are all of the people that are interacting with it, whether they're a user, it's being used on them, or they're a stakeholder of it, and really get clear on those so that we can look at it from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, Kim, I love that comment that we have to think about it from all of the different users and their expectations. I always think a great example of this in our daily lives has to do with elevators. So people don't hesitate to stick their arm in a closing elevator, right? Which is actually insane if you think about it, because, you know, a ton of metal powered by, you know, a motor is closing, and you should expect your arm to get crushed, but we all expect the elevator to detect your arm and move away without any harm. So I think that's a great example. Yeah, thanks.
Harry, can I jump in just really quickly? Because there's one thing that I want to point out, that, and this is something that FDA has struggled with, which is why I have to jump on this, or somehow my boss will know and find me. I take the point really well about, you know, if you update a device, that device is not the same one as, you know, it was prior to the update. I think we have to be very careful when we as the FDA, and I think we as a society need to be very careful around this idea, because a problem that FDA has run into, and we are continuously myth busting this, and we literally have a slide deck like that says it's myth busting. In regulated industries, where you have to get regulatory approval before your device can go on market, we have an issue where security updates should be routine. You know, the security update, or whatever the basic update is, it needs to be able to happen on a regular cadence. And if you have to get regulatory approval every time that you need to update a device, that's not sustainable. And so we do have this issue where we constantly have to tell manufacturers, like, you cannot use us as the excuse for why you can't update your device. Because they will tell healthcare delivery organizations and others, oh, we can't give you an update because then we'd have to go get FDA approval again. So just it's one of these things where, speaking of trustworthy devices, you know, we do have to balance the fact that updating the device does change it with the fact that in heavily regulated industries, there's other considerations that have to come into it.
I love that point. That's a great point, which is, you know, we don't want these things to be an excuse for bad practices, right? And actually, this is to Jennifer's earlier point, is there are verification methods that can be used to still verify that the device works properly, even after it has changed hardware or software, firmware. Anyone else want to, Brian? Go ahead.
And there are verification methods to make sure that the package of firmware that the device is getting, that can be signed by the manufacturer, and that can be verified to know this is an approved update. These are the keys that were trusted by the device. This can be done. And then we get into an ethics question of, why are some devices not doing this? Especially those devices where there's safety critical or life critical things on the line. Like, we have this technology available. We aren't demanding that from device manufacturers right now. And should we be, right? There's a question on that front. But I love that, Jessica. And yes, there is a responsibility, I think, as well for security updates. If you are aware of problems in your device, you should be updating that. And I love what Jessica said about, you know, no, don't use excuses on this front. You have this device, let's fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add on to that. I completely agree with everything that Brian and Jessica are saying, and the DoD has just this issue as well, right? We have what's called a continuous authority to operate, which is our assurance strategy, right? Because we need to make sure that, yes, these cyber vulnerabilities are being dealt with, but we're also not messing with the safety properties of whatever hardware as we're updating it. And I think there's also a question about how can we expand the technology to make it so that we can automatically generate assurance evidence as folks are putting out those software patches and those updates to the mission critical features. And there's a whole question about how to improve our tooling in a way that doesn't just say, as a computer scientist, say, well, you have this bug in your code, so it won't compile or whatever, but instead is starting to say, well, you added this functionality and you address this patch, but you introduced these other vulnerabilities. These need to be fixed before that goes out, so that the safety properties as well as the cybersecurity properties are all maintained. And there's a lot that we can be doing on the software side to make that much more robust.
Terrific. Yeah, what a great discussion so far. Let me throw out this next question to Brian, and then to the rest of the panel after that. Brian, what are some of the problems that we are worried about if a system is not trustworthy? And you have actual examples of, in the real world, of systems that have not proven trustworthy.
Sure. I think I'm gonna answer this tying it into some of the stuff we were just talking about, because we were talking about ways to update devices and manage that. We saw SolarWinds recently. This ties into some of the supply chain things. In that situation, the code push was actually signed as well, right? So this was the supply chain got in before approved, hey, this should go into your infrastructure, even though there was a vulnerability inserted. It's that kind of vulnerability.
Brian, let me just interrupt you for one second. We just explained for the audience very briefly what SolarWinds is, just to make sure that everyone understands what that's about.
Sure. So SolarWinds is a tool that network operators and hardware operators use to monitor what's happening inside their network. It automates a lot of manual processes. The trick is that when you do that, you authorize it to do all kinds of things. So you've given it the authority inside your network to have a pretty large impact if it were to be compromised. And we found out recently, we are going to be talking about this in cybersecurity for the next 5 to 10 years, by the way, right? The implications on supply chain and security there, software bill of materials, how we track what's in each package as it gets delivered so we can find vulnerabilities like Heartbleed. It's this kind of approach, especially with a tool that is as connected as SolarWinds, the impact for this and I'll say the skill, although I'm not giving kudos to it. It's still criminal, and but the tooling was very impressive with that particular attack, and we're seeing our adversaries increase their ability to reach out to these vulnerabilities. An example that I'm going to use now from like the home user perspective, right? A smart home. If you have this device, they still sell them, although some retailers have said, hey, we're going to take this off the market. But a Cloud Pet, and I don't know if anybody remembers what a Cloud Pet is. It's got a little, you hook it up to your Wi-Fi, you give it credentials to your Wi-Fi, and it's got a video camera and a speaker in it. And the idea was that grandma and grandpa can talk to the grandkid through this cool stuffed toy, and isn't that great? There's a tool out there called Shodan, which searches all connected devices on the internet and then lists those devices. And then there's a set of exploits that go against each one of the devices. So here are the tools that you can go and you can download and run against these devices. So this innocent device, and people look at this and say, I'm not really concerned. Who's going to monitor me? Who's going to care what I do? It doesn't matter. I'm not a target, so I'm not going to worry about cybersecurity or privacy. But this device, if you hook it up, lasts maybe 10 minutes before it's compromised. It will not stay on the network long before its advertising has triggered automated scripts. The new firmware will get loaded on it. It turns on the microphone all the time and sits there and listens. And it pipes that microphone to a speech to text. And then all that text gets put into a file that gets searched for, hey, anytime you guys mention maybe 9 numbers in a row, if you have 16 numbers in a row, make sure you call that out, especially if somebody says expiration or social security, call this out, bank account info, all of that. It's not that somebody's targeting you. It's that you've now made all of this information available for automated scripts. That is what we need to protect against. And these devices, we have to protect the network, not the device. People say, oh, I don't need to put security on the Cloud Pet because who cares if somebody hacks it, right? It's a tiny device. But the trick is that that device can then be used to attack other things in your network and pull extra info out. So it's very important. Those are things that we do need to worry about.
Great, Brian. I love that. And just to go back to your earlier point about SolarWinds, and this gets to Jennifer's point, is that, this was a trusted system that a lot of different organizations, including the federal government, used to manage their own operations. And somebody got into SolarWinds itself, hacked their system. So trusted updates were coming into all these different organizations with a hack in it that allowed them to exploit it. And Jennifer, as you said, that's part of the supply chain, right? Making sure that every point along the way. And I love the comment you just said, Brian, which is protect the network, not the device. And that gets to Jennifer's point, which is graceful failure, right? No matter how it happens. I'll throw this out to the rest of the panel. Anyone want to comment on this? Just raise your hand if you want to follow up. Jessica, I see your hand there.
Yeah, so I think the big one that I would want to respond to is I think I do appreciate you have to protect the network. You absolutely do. I think you have to protect the devices too. I think a lot of people use the term defense in depth. Some love it, some hate it. But anywhere that you can put on a security control, just put the security control on, put it on the device, put it on the network, put it wherever you can. Because to the exact point that Brian made, there are so many automated exploit kits out there. I don't think you specifically mentioned Metasploit or Cobalt Strike, all these things, where it's literally you download it, you plug it in, and it runs itself. That it's very difficult to protect against everything. But especially on the FDA side, the devices have to be protected. We absolutely are not going to accept, and we do have manufacturers and sometimes others who try this, who sort of say, well, the device is going to be sitting in this quarantined network by itself, so it's fine. Every potential risk is compensated for, and we don't need to do anything with the device. That's completely unacceptable to us. And so, I think it has to be both. It has to be security anywhere and everywhere you can put it.
Great point.
I really have to clarify, because I wasn't disagreeing with that, Jessica. The point was you do have to secure the devices. The reason you have to do it is not because, oh, I'm going to hack a Barbie doll or I'm going to hack the Cloud Pet. It's because this gives you an attack surface from which to launch additional attacks. Every device must be protected. So I just wanted to clarify, because I wanted you to know that I absolutely agree.
Yes, maybe it's protect not only the device, but also the network. Yeah, so let me just clarify a little bit for the audience out there might not understand some of this terminology. We talk about exploits, and these are basically, usually these are accidental bugs left in software or hardware that hackers can use to take over or hack into software or hardware. And an exploit kit out there, basically they've automated, they get lists of these vulnerabilities, and then they automate the process of trying each new one on a device, and it makes it very easy for ordinary people to take over devices. Did I see other hands up there? Kim?
Yeah, so I had, when I read this question initially, I had sort of a different example, I think, of a situation where, a device, really a software vendor, broke down trust. So the example that I was thinking about is, I think it was last year, Facebook targeted teenagers through their phones they paid them $10 or something like that to install an app on their phone. And it was actually a Facebook research app. And they were using, sort of sniffing out usage on the phone, and then using that data to then, you know, drive beneficial outcomes to Facebook, you know, not to the teenagers or, you know, parents who might be concerned. So I think, you know, Apple ended up getting wind of this and removed the app, and it got shut down. But this question too just made me think of vulnerable populations who are interacting with a device, and ways that, you know, in this case, a software vendor, a social media company, really kind of acted outside of the norm of what, you know, what that user would think, and then certainly what a stakeholder would think, you know, in the form of parents. So, but I think, Brian, it kind of, it illustrates your point too, that this device then just becomes, you know, a window into a lot of other information that could be used in a way that, you know, folks might not view as acceptable.
Great. Yeah. So I heard a slightly different principle in there. The first part of this discussion was talking largely about being able to rely from an authentication standpoint that your hardware is operating as functional. And Kim, you put a different dimension, is when is your hardware not acting in your best interest, although it appears to be. And that's a good example of trustworthiness. And, you know, you might think that Facebook is acting according to norms, but underneath the surface, it is doing something else. Great. Anyone else want to weigh in on this? Jennifer.
Yeah, I'd like to just expand on some of the things that Brian was saying about Showdown, because I think there's a whole breadth. So again, this is a pretty public data set. They go, they scan the internet, they find, you know, a variety of devices. And I think there's different types of ways that you can attack a system. Some of them involve these exploits where there's a bug in the software and somebody who's very highly skilled can go and take advantage of that in order to have some type of effect on the device. Some of them are just more benign. It's just that many devices are shipped with default username and passwords. And you would be shocked at the millions of devices that you can get in just by saying, I'm going to try and log in with a username of username and a password of password. You can take over lots of internet infrastructure, routers throughout the internet. It's also possible via things that are available in Shodan. There are examples of other types of devices like stoplights or systems that control power, either power to data centers or power to utilities, et cetera, right? A number of these are visible on the internet, and somebody with, you know, really not that deep of experience in hacking into systems can just access quite a lot by using our default username and passwords. And then it gets more complicated when we start to build systems, because you can take a variety of off-the-shelf components that each might have default username and password along with a lot of default configurations. You put them all together, and it's actually possible to hack into some quite complicated systems just because you can use the default configurations in one to access something from another, and then log into it, use its default configurations to access another, and kind of weave your way through the security holes that are just, you know, created by putting these components together in a novel way. So because of the complexity of our systems, there's this need to have even automation to look at the security that comes from taking these devices that individually might be secure, but you put them together, and there's a way to kind of, you know, weave your way through in some to have an effect that would be detrimental to the system as a whole.
Yeah, Jennifer, great point. And I think that gets a lot of Jessica's point and Brian's point, which are all these attack surfaces make it, you know, very difficult. And there's this concept that might be beyond the scope of this discussion about zero trust systems, but I think Jessica was referencing towards that, where you build your system assuming that every part of it, you know, has been infiltrated, and assuming that, how do we still, you know, operate gracefully? Anyone else want to continue with this, or shall we keep moving along? Okay, great. So let me throw this next question out to Kim and then the rest of the panel. How do we make systems trustworthy? And we've already talked about this, but maybe we can elaborate. What are some of the difficulties in getting there?
Yeah, so first I'll just say, my orientation around this is definitely influenced by what JumpCloud does. So we, just so you all are aware, we help admins, IT admins provide secure access to primarily, laptops for their employees or students or whomever their users are. And so actually we talk about zero trust a lot. And so when I was kind of reflecting on this, I think, the first thing that I would say, and we've already talked about it today, is just knowing who your users and stakeholders are and what their perceptions and expectations are. I think secondarily, and again, we've talked about this a lot today as well, is what are those attack vectors? What are those ways that things could go wrong? And kind of identifying those things as early in the process as you can when you're thinking about the design of a system or a device. But then in the vein of zero trust, we talk about, three main components there. So the first being, making sure that the person who's using the device is who they say they are. And that's where a tool like multi-factor authentication might come into play. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with that, that would be something in addition to a password. Sometimes it might even be in lieu of a password, but it's a second or third way to verify that the person is who they say they are. So it might be something that they have. So maybe they enter their password into the device and then they get a code on their phone and they have to re-enter that code. It might be something that they are, and that gets a little bit into biometrics and some future trends. So it's their fingerprint, like on your iPhone, or a face scan. And then, so that's the first step, is making sure that the person who's interacting with it, assuming it's not a public device, is who they say they are. The second step is making sure that the device is secured itself. So in the example of, a person at work in their laptop, the IT person would want to make sure that laptop has a good security stance. It's got antivirus software installed, maybe there are policies installed on there that make it so that users can't go out and download software that might be malicious. So just making sure that device is secured, and then making sure that it is connected to a secure network, or a network that it should be, from a location that it should be. So those are kind of the main things that we think about when we're thinking about zero trust, is verifying the person is who they say they are, the device is secure, and the network and location make sense and are secure for that device.
And Kim,
And then I think, difficulties that come in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I just wanted, would you mind clarifying from the audience, just what are some of the problems if you just have a basic authentication system without zero trust that we're worried about?
Yeah, so I think actually Jennifer's example is a great one. Humans who define their own password don't always pick, they may pick something that they remember, it's easy for them to remember. They've got 500 zillion passwords everywhere, they use the same one for everything. And so it's easy for an attacker to guess or kind of identify the pattern. So then the multi-factor authentication just adds another layer of security.
We saw an example of that just this week, right? On Monday, we had Oldsmar, Florida. We had somebody use remote access to come in to control a computer that increased the sodium hydroxide levels in that town's water supply. And it was caught only because another person happened to be walking by the computer and saw the mouse move and increase that level that could have poisoned an entire community, right? These are very real, very important threats. And the idea of, hey, we're just gonna rely on passwords, we cannot do that any longer, right? Our industry, our profession, we have to increase what we're doing. We have to start talking about certificates. We have to start talking about real proof of not just necessarily who the person is, right? But when you trust, it goes beyond that. It's what are their intentions today, right? And is there a need for supervision on some of these systems? It's things like that. And I was alarmed at that. I hope everybody who hears this is as equally alarmed that like, hey, our water supply is automated.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brian. Thank you for, let me just jump back to Kim real quick, because I think she had another point about some of the difficulties in getting there, and then I'll throw this out to the rest of the panel.
Yeah, so I'll just highlight a few of the difficulties that I think we can encounter in our world, and there are many more, of course. But like I said, you know, we want our admins to feel confident that the device that they're in charge of is secure. Well, even in the workplace, there's a really strong bring your own device model. So people are using personal phones to do work, and that presents a challenge for ensuring that device is secured from sort of the organization's perspective. So that's definitely something that we talk about. I think too, like Brian was just bringing up, like there are contextual things too that can come into play. So using his example, or there's lots of other ones. Maybe it's, you know, access to a financial system or access to healthcare data. There are certain contexts where an added level of security may be needed, and that can be a challenge to sort of design for, and then help the users understand, you know, what they're going through. So those are just a couple examples of things that I think can make it difficult.
Great. So let me throw this same question out to the rest of the panel, or follow-ups. How do we make systems trustworthy? What are the difficulties in getting there? And we've heard some great examples. I saw Jessica, did you want to comment?
So half the time I feel like my job is raining on people's parades. Maybe another one of those situations. So I don't disagree with anything that anyone has said. I absolutely think our over-reliance on passwords, and specifically passwords that people come up with themselves, is bad. It's outdated. We shouldn't be doing it. But one of the things that we deal with, not only at the FDA, but the broader Department of Health and Human Services and the healthcare system generally, is not having access to digital systems when you need it can kill people. So if the EHR is down, if you cannot get access to the EHR, you might not be able to give somebody treatment. You know, if you can't get access to a medical device that you need access to, that patient might get harmed. And so one of the complications that we see in security is that part of the purpose of security is to prevent people from accessing systems. And with the way, you know, people are bad at security generally. I lock myself out of my laptop and my Zoom account and everything else, you know, every other week, just because I'm not thinking, I do something wrong, whatever it is. When you have when you have nurses and doctors who are losing access to critical systems in the middle of care delivery, that's a problem. And I think one of the issues that we see is that in a lot of cases, a lot of cybersecurity experts who are coming in trying to advise the healthcare sector, they're IT experts, they're general IT experts, they're not healthcare cybersecurity experts. And so they're trying to overlay general IT practices over top of the healthcare industry, the healthcare sector, and it just doesn't work. And so I suppose this whole thing is just a little bit of a note of caution to say we absolutely do need better security, but on some cases it's going to have to be on a sector by sector basis, because I can certainly speak for healthcare, but you know, the water system got brought up, or electricity got brought up. There are going to be unique considerations there about what absolutely has to keep running, what absolutely has to be available when security drops down in the priority list above availability and integrity and other issues like that. So it's another complicating factor.
Yeah, that's a great point, Jessica. And there's definitely a trade-off between security and accessibility. And I think we're going to explore that. You know, we wouldn't want a doctor having to log into his defibrillator, someone's having a heart attack if he can't remember his password. Let me throw that point. Anyone want to follow up on Jessica's point? Brian, I see, and then Kim.
So I love the break glass in case of emergency type model for Jessica's example, right? Where it's like, hey, I need to get past this. I know there's an audit that's going to come afterwards, but right now, right, somebody's life is on the line, and the ability to do that. And again, sector by sector, to Jessica's point, there are going to have to be limits on what you can do in those situations too, right? Like, hey, we want to break the glass on the nuclear launch codes. No, actually, we don't, right? And so there are going to be trade-offs in every case for what makes sense. When you asked Harry about how do we secure devices, right? I think the fundamental first step of this is device identity. And it has to be one where that identity is globally unique, it's immutable, and it must be mathematically attestable. So I need to know that nobody else can spoof and pretend to be that device, and this device can't pretend to be somebody else, right? And so once I have that, I have a tree that I can decorate with all kinds of additional security rules and tooling based on the industry that I'm going to move to, right? So if you've got that certificate, you can move on to AAA. So the authentication, the authorization, and the auditability of what happens. And then you get into, Jessica was bringing this up, the confidentiality of messages and of data, the integrity of those messages in the data, and then the availability of the device, right? Particularly medical availability is, it's not CIA, it's ACI, right? Where it's like, hey, that's the most important thing. But if you can get to like a digital certificate that you can then say, this is owned, and there's keys behind it that are kept, and we can ratchet up the security levels. We can talk about agility. We can talk about future threats like quantum that may have an impact on data that's coming today. But when we talk about some of this stuff, first we need the framework, and then we can talk about how we tweak it to address those future threats. Identity is key, though. I think that's the foundation for all of it.
Brian, I'll jump to Kim in a second, but I just want to follow up on that point. Can you give examples today where lack of authentication is causing big problems that might be solved with the authentication system that you described?
Well, it's back to the password thing, right? So, if you're not authenticating a device and allowing it permissions on the network based on its specific credentials, so you know who it is, that's the authentication, and the authorization is what can it do on the network. When you have a situation where video cameras and the IoT devices, the DVRs that recorded the video cameras, well, 2016, we saw the Mirai attack. And this was, hey guys, thanks for open sourcing this tool that allows anybody to download it, tweak it, and run and say, hey, how many devices can I compromise? Oh, I got hundreds of millions of devices, and I'm going to use that in a denial of service attack that coincidentally hit some of the specific routers that had some weaknesses as well. And that brought down the Eastern Seaboard in 2016, one of the largest distributed denial of service attacks available. Those devices, these are being leveraged economically. If I go to the dark web today, I can get 100 megabit per second attack for an hour. That can cause $40,000 to $50,000 worth of damage to a company. It costs me $5 to do this because the devices are so pervasive, so cheap to go and infect, that the market economy is shifted. And now the adversaries have the economic advantage over us. We have to switch that. We have to secure these devices so that it's more costly to compromise the devices than it is any gain that you get back from that compromise. And until we do that, we're going to continue to see these problems. Great.
Thanks, Brian. And I'll just add on to that. More common examples where spoofing is causing problems in real life are robocalling. We can't, authenticate phone numbers. You can spoof emails. So that leads to all sorts of social engineering, and also texting. Our text systems are not secure. Kim, I know you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, no, I just kind of wanted to come back to Jessica's point of there are these situations where the convenience of getting into the device trumps the security, or seemingly so. And Harry, you mentioned this as well. often security and then convenient user access are polar opposites. I think, those of us that are technologists, I really think it is on us to come up with creative solutions where we are providing a highly secure, access to a device, and it's appropriately convenient for the context. And I think there are ways to do that. So Jessica, I'm not in healthcare, and I am not a security expert. I'm coming at this more from a user experience standpoint. But, if I think about a situation where a doctor needs that device immediately, maybe there's a way to secure the perimeter in a different way. And I think that comes back to what Brian was saying, which is just ways to ensure the identity on that device is exactly accurate so that the experience can then be really convenient and easy when it matters.
Jennifer.
So I agree with everything that folks have been saying. And I think if we pop back to the question of, how do we get there? I think if we're looking forward, we also need to be considering the changes that we're anticipating in the devices in the future. And I think one trend is that, in the same way that we have seen a growing number of devices having embedded software, now we're seeing a growing number of devices having embedded AI. And embedded AI comes with a whole new set of attack surfaces, right? And I think we can broadly think about this as being part of two categories. One is the attack surfaces comes with the data, and then the other is the attack surface that comes with the algorithms. So really, we also need to be thinking about what are the new types of defenses that we need in order to, say, detect content manipulation. So people, putting falsified data in order to poison some type of algorithm or lead to some type of undesired behavior in the device. And also, how do we fix the AI algorithms so that they're less susceptible to certain types of attacks? So I think that's just a up and coming area that we also need to be thinking about.
Great, Jennifer. I love that point. And AI, right? The more we use AI, the more we have semi-autonomy where the system itself is making decisions, and that only adds to the complication. And just to clarify some terminology out there, for people who aren't familiar, attack surface generally means, different methods or means that are exposed to hackers. The more ways hackers can get into something, the more attack surfaces, the more different ways they can get in there. Anyone else want to weigh on at this point, or we can move to the next topic? All right, let me move forward. And Jessica, you already started talking about this, but let me continue with this. There does seem to be this critical trade-off between trustworthiness, security authentication on the one hand, and usability and accessibility for lay users. So, medical devices are used by healthcare professionals who are not usually technology experts and are often under emergency circumstances. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about these trade-offs.
Yeah, well, and I think actually the person who sort of started laying it out best was Kim, which is that, we have, and I this could be a conference in and of itself of sort of figuring out how we got to the point of pushing security responsibility onto the users. Like, you don't click that link, you don't open that attachment, you don't do whatever it is, and then it's a personal failure on the user's fault if they do it. Whereas in my point of view, if a user of a system is able to create a major security incident by doing their job, that's not their fault. That's the fault of the designer of the system. And so, I've made all this huge song and dance about accessibility for medical devices, and there are times when the availability is going to be more critical than the security. But please make no mistake, you will not get through the FDA approval process if your device is not appropriately secured. And so it is very much so this trade-off. It's one of these things where we look at, we have pacemakers, we have other kinds of devices that are being literally surgically implanted into people's bodies that have cybersecurity concerns, or, the cybersecurity of the devices is relevant. And so, it becomes this process where the reviewers at FDA work very closely with the manufacturers who are coming to us with their products to go through and essentially say, what is your security process? What are your security controls? What's your update mechanism? And all of these kinds of things. And, I love the FDA. I think FDA is great, of course, because we do have experts who manage to thread that needle of they are medical experts and they understand how the cybersecurity comes in. So they're very able to say, here's the trade-off between the cybersecurity control and the therapeutic. And in that way, the FDA and the manufacturers manage to balance it out. But I think we need more of that. And so I know, this panel has generally been about the technology itself and how do we design better technology. If there's one thing that working in critical infrastructure cybersecurity has taught me, it's that people matter a ton. And what we need, what I am continuously arguing in the healthcare space, is we need people who are both cybersecurity experts and medical experts, because it's really only once you start combining those two categories that you can start designing systems that meet both needs, that you can start having, you can start changing the calculus of the benefit risk calculation, because you have people who understand how to come at those problems in that way. And so I would say probably, that I think that's another huge thing, is just while we're here talking about technology and technology is critical, don't forget that, not only your users, but the people who are designing the systems are a critical element of whether or not your system is going to be trustworthy.
Jessica, I love that point, that we need people who are, interdisciplinary, who understand it from both perspectives. And that probably, the education system has a role to play in that, of which I'm a part. Another point I heard in there, which I love too, is the critical role of processes. So it seems like the FDA has processes that require the makers to articulate what are you doing along all of these dimensions, and institutionalizing those security and other processes sounds like another key component there. Brian, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I again, Jessica, I love following you because I get to say, like, yes, that security people are not fungible. It's not that you can take somebody in one industry and move them to another and it's going to magically work, right? Every industry is going to have its own nuance and decision-making calculus around risk. One topic that we haven't talked about when we talk about systems and trustworthiness, though, and I wanted to bring it up before we close, we've had a very cybersecurity focus on this today. We have talked about, the risk to the devices, to the network, and Jessica and Kim, I think, are doing a great job of bringing this back to the people. There is a privacy risk with devices as well, right? It's not just, hey, you're on Facebook and what you put there, different people can see. Your thermostat is watching you, right? Your garage doors are watching you. And that behavior, if it's not correctly protected, and even once, like to Jennifer's point with the AI, right? Okay, great, you're doing on-premise analysis so that you're not sending maybe video to the cloud to be processed, but you're doing that on premise. The information that you glean from that analysis is still leaving. And so that has to be protected, not just in transit, but wherever the hell it's getting stored. Because if I can then determine, oh, you are away from your home at this time, or, oh, you have this particular medical device in your body, and I can identify, I can track you, I can do all kinds of really bad things. And we're seeing that, right? We're seeing cyber stalking, we're seeing abuse situations, even inside a home with some of these devices. The privacy aspect of these devices is going to be an important track in trustworthiness as we go forward.
Great. Does anyone else want to follow up on this question? Okay, great. And then we're going to open it up to the audience in just a minute, but I just want to throw out one final question because I think it's so interesting. When we say a system is trustworthy, who do we mean primarily? Is it the users, society, the makers? If it's a medical device, is it the healthcare professionals or those being treated? How do we think about this and some of the trade-offs there? I know it's a big question. So let me, just raise your hand if you want to weigh in on it. Jessica.
Yeah, if I can get us started on this one, because it's actually, I was gonna, beg your indulgence to make a separate point, but I think it ends up tying in well to this. For me, it's interesting. I think when I felt younger, I'm so old now, but when I was younger and first getting started in this, the idea of this malicious actor, this hacker sitting somewhere was very sexy, and that's where everyone's attention goes, is the bad guy is doing something bad. What I've started to shift to, I guess, as I've gotten older and crusty and cynical, is I actually almost don't care as much about the bad actors. Like, they're going to be there, they're going to do things. But when systems can fall down just because they're being used, that's what I care about, is when you have critical infrastructure systems that are just going to collapse under the fact that somebody is attempting to use them as intended. And we have that happen all the time. Critical infrastructure systems will just go down because they were built in '85, and the system really hasn't been updated since then. And so trustworthiness, to me, is almost synonymous with resilience, which is something is going to happen. There's going to be a configuration error. There's going to be an attack. Somebody's going to deliberately try to screw with your system. It's not an if, it's a when. And so your system, to me, is not trustworthy unless you can weather that, whatever it is. If you can survive the incident, you can survive the event and have minimal impact to you, to your patients, to the broader internet, since we've seen how fast some of these things can propagate. That's what, to me, makes a system trustworthy. And then just really quickly, the point that I would want to make, and I just want to underline, is my piece of advice, whatever we'll call it this, is, I do personally think we over-focus on bad guys in cyber, and we need to be thinking much, much more about just stuff falling apart.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that ties into some of Jennifer's earlier comments about graceful degradation, no matter what the cause, and some of Brian's thoughts in that area. Trustworthy to who? Anyone want to weigh in on 30 seconds real quick before we open it up to the audience? Kim, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think just piggybacking on what Jessica is saying, I think it's the legitimate users of that device, whether they're choosing to be a user of the device or not, the stakeholders that may exist kind of around those users, anyone whose data resides on that device or, could be kind of sucked out, especially if it could be tied to their personal information or identity. And then also the owner of the device. So, in the example of, healthcare, the hospital needs to trust that device is going to work for their needs and kind of everything around it to protect the organization.
Okay, great. And then I think that ties into an earlier point you made about Facebook, which is it trustworthy, that Facebook example is trustworthy to Facebook, but not the users, and we have a conflict of interest. Brian, did I see your hand up there? No, okay. All right, so let's throw this out to our student, Taylor. Taylor, I'd love to hear your thoughts here.
Okay, hello. So I have a question. It's probably more directed at Jennifer because it's DoD related, but it also ties in automation. So Harry, if you wanted to add on the end of it, that would be great. My name is Taylor Hartley. I'm an MBA student. I'm also a naval intelligence veteran of 8 years. You'll hear more about that later if you stay for the debate. So I have an interest in 5G and automation, right? Specifically automation in the military. And I know that means a lot of job loss for a lot of people, but in the military, that's good. That's fewer people deployed, that's fewer people in the field, and that's lives saved. However, looking at the equipment required for 5G networks for the Department of Defense, they cannot have any piece of equipment that's from China. So, and overall, there's a huge overdependency on equipment from China in the US military. So, can automation help the US decrease this dependency on Chinese hardware? Can we even get there without it? And if we do, who or what can I trust? It feels like kind of a chicken and egg situation.
Great question. Great question. And I'd Given your interests, it would be worth looking into the OPS 5G program, actually. So there's a DARPA program specifically aimed at decoupling some of this dependence on foreign hardware, right? And if we look at the security needs for 5G and the way that many of these requirements are addressed today, one of the issues is that the hardware and the software are deeply coupled, right? You have devices that come out where they're developing the hardware, the same company or related group is providing that software. So what we're missing is that layer of abstraction, which makes it so that you can have many different hardware companies, US or otherwise, address the same level of abstraction to get the 5G software components. And one of the things that makes it difficult for us to have that separation between hardware vendors and software today is that it takes a lot of time to come up with the secure software, to develop it quickly enough. So one of the things that the new technology coming out of OPS 5G is aiming to do is shorten that and make it so that we have open source verified software that's coming out that creates this level of abstraction, right? And is available to everyone in order to democratize the ability for hardware and software vendors to put up their own solution at lower cost in order to change the equities to make it so that we can reduce some of this foreign dependence.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question?
From a technical perspective, and Taylor and 5G, some of the work that's happening in the 3GPP, the SA3 group, focuses on security. There's a lot of focus on mutual authentication now, and the idea of, hey, I need to not only let you know that my handset is what it says it is, but I need to know that you're the network that you claim to be, right? So this is the stingrays, the tools that are used to potentially monitor who's in which location at which time, surreptitiously. That in a military situation, you don't want necessarily to identify inside the theater where your friendlies are and where others aren't, right? So the idea of that clear mutual authentication up front is one of the things that I know the DoD folks at SA3 are pushing that as well. So I think there's some technical answers to this. I'm going to stay out of the policy questions.
Any other thoughts on this question? Thank you, Taylor. We'll love to take another question from the audience.
I see we have a couple in the QA box, Harry.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll read one of the questions out. The first one from AJ Heron. What does the panel think about if continued attacks, such as mentioned here, eventually create two access points, a limited access system for home interconnected devices, or a very limited internet for the common user and a larger secure system? What does your panel think about a concept such as that?
I'm happy to jump in on this one because I think it ties into the next question as well. So Michelle was asking about, hey, what do we do here in the future, right? How do we handle this? How do you push back economically? I think that this goes back to device security and the responsibility. If you're a manufacturer of devices, and to look at kind of AJ's question, you're creating a device. It's going to do some purpose, right? It's a smart light bulb, and it's going to sit in your home. You're going to give it credentials. It's access in and out. Are we trying to cut that down? I think we're looking at pervasive computing. These devices are going to be everywhere, use all kinds of different radios. You're going to have LoRa, 6LoWPAN, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, 5G, from the previous question, right? There, all of these things, that it's all going to happen. We're not going to be crimping down the network, and we're opening it up, if anything. So the responsibility really has to come back to the device. The network can't solve and fix and clean up after this. It's very much a responsibility of that manufacturer. The problem economically is that manufacturer, once they sell the device, every single thing they do, every security patch they push, if they aren't mandated to do that, their incentive is actually, it's a negative economic incentive. They have to spend the time, they have to push the device, they risk bricking the device with the update if things go wrong. They have consumers bringing it back. And so there is a risk to doing that. And so manufacturers by default don't want to update their devices. But as consumers, we have to demand that, no, I'm not buying this device, right? And when I had a new fridge for a number of reasons, and I didn't want a smart fridge, but it has smart elements to it. The fridge warranty is for 15 years, right? Hey, if anything major goes wrong with the fridge, 15 years, you're good. The software that runs it is a warranty for 6 months. Wait, I'm not gonna replace my fridge in 6 months because you guys didn't update this. So the update aspect, I think it addresses AJ's and Michelle's, right? I think the push has to be from a market angle. And I think you got to look at this economically. This isn't a technical solution.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, 2 points I just want to draw out of that is that, trustworthiness is expensive, right? Maintaining trustworthy, building it into the system and then ongoing updates. And this also seems to be a way the law or the government could play a role in here in creating incentives either through regulation or through the tort system, making it so that these companies internalize these external costs. I saw some hands up there. Yeah, Jessica.
So I'm going to try and make 2 really quick points. So one, to follow up on something that Brian was saying, we're running into an issue. This is more in hospitals we're seeing than anything else, where there's so much micro segmentation happening because people are trying to quarantine different devices that it's actually undermining the whole point of having connected healthcare. Because it just doesn't work. So I think in that sense, I'm very wary of going into the direction of having sort of these balkanized, types of different internets for different people for different purposes. I think we do need to get to the point where we just figure out how to do it on the internet as is. The second thing, and I think this hits also the point that you were saying about regulation and then some of Brian's points. Software bill of materials was mentioned earlier. We didn't go into it in any great depth, but software bill of materials is a huge factor for FDA. It's something that we're expecting to require as part of medical device pre-market submissions. If you want to get your device on the market, you're going to have to give us a software bill of materials. And one of the things that we're anticipating.
Did I just interrupt? Could you just explain what a software bill of materials is?
Sure. Yes. So a software bill of materials is, as points have been made here, software is built out of other pieces of software. But in most cases, if you buy a final product, like Brian, when he bought his smart fridge, did not receive a list of all of the upstream pieces of software that his fridge contains. And this is a problem, and I think it was Jennifer who had talked about this a little bit earlier. You are exposed to all of the vulnerabilities that exist in your software supply chain. And so the software bill of materials allows you to take some of that into account and sort of see where you might be vulnerable. The other thing that we're hoping to see, though, is as software bill of materials spread, certainly in the medical device sector, but in others, it's going to push security requirements into that upstream, because if I'm a medical device manufacturer and I have to provide a software bill of materials, I don't want to put vulnerable software into my device because people are going to know about it. And so I might turn around and say, I'm not using your software. I'm not putting your software in my device unless you make it securable, unless you tell me it's going to be updatable, and so on and so forth. And so that's another thing that we're hoping to see.
Great. So we've got 1 more minute. Jennifer, it looks like Jennifer and Kim both went away. So Jennifer, take it away.
Great. So I think I wanted to build on a couple of the things that were pointed out about cost and how security costs money, right? And the fact that, we really need to be looking at these incentives, these financial incentives, if we want to make more secure systems. This also ties into the points about who are the people trustworthy to whom, to society, to users, to the person who's buying. And I think, when we look at things today, right, it costs companies money to add security. In some sense, they are going to be beholden to whoever's purchasing the device, which may or may not be the user, and certainly is not society as a whole, right? So if we want to be looking at like, well, what's secure, what's going to be beneficial to many people, society, the end user, all of those different things, we need to look at how do we make it so that there is a financial incentive for organizations to add in security. And in terms of how do we get there, one of the points that Jessica made about like, well, it's the end user that's at fault anytime that, something goes wrong on the security side. That is a default. What does that allow us to do? It makes it so that when there is some type of problem with the system, it's the user's fault. The manufacturer's not at fault. There is no financial incentive for them to add security because at the end of the day, it's all of those users, right? And until that type of dynamic changes and there is some type of financial incentive to add security, either by policy, by whatever other mechanisms, we're not going to end up with what I would say would be the end goal, where we're looking at security for the end user and society as a whole.
Great, Jennifer. Thank you for that point about aligning incentives. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank you guys for a really terrific discussion. I learned so much, and I'm so grateful that you joined us. And I hope to see everyone again. And thanks again for such a terrific, informative discussion. I think we made some progress here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harry.